Welcome to this presentation on AI and justice. Actually, it's such an enormous subject that maybe a better title would be Who Judges the Judges? Interesting question in itself. What I shall do here is develop some of the problems associated with the justice system as we see it today. And I shall do that through some examples principally, and then come up with a suggestion of how to incorporate AI in this justice system in order to reinforce justice. So let me start by telling you a story. Now, this is actually a poem written by a Danish poet. His name was Vessel, and it was written in 1770, so this is an old story, but unfortunately it is just as true today as it was back then. Now, there is this village, and in this village someone is murdered, and there is one blacksmith and there are two bakers in the village, and the murderer is the blacksmith, and he actually confesses in court that he committed the murder. Now, the problem is that if the judge convicts the blacksmith to death, because that is the sentence, then the village no longer has a blacksmith, and they need a blacksmith. However, they have two bakers, and they don't need more than one baker. So what the judge decides is, of course, that one of the bakers, actually the older of the two, is convicted for the murder of the person who was assassinated, of course, and the blacksmith is free. We can learn a lot from that story. And what I just want to use the story for here is to demonstrate that one of the principles that was, of course, completely disregarded in that case was the presumption of innocence. And actually, in this particular case, there was no doubt that the baker was innocent. But the presumption of innocence is also being heavily challenged today by social media and also by this tendency of political correctness. Political correctness and social media have shifted the burden of proof so that there is really a danger to the presumption of innocence. And of course, the influence on judges is something that is pervasive, I would say, and I shall give you some examples afterwards. Judges don't live on a different planet. They're people like the rest of us, and they're subject to all kinds of influences like the rest of us. And it's very, very important to understand that as this trend continues, we may actually see cases that will resemble very much the story about the blacksmith and the baker, where somebody is convicted simply because of the burden of proof and the presumption of innocence being challenged by social media. It's very hard for a judge to stand up and apply the law in a serene and calm fashion if social media are screaming for revenge of some sort of, mostly of an ill-founded nature. It's not a new thing that trials are unpredictable. This is what all lawyers will actually tell you when you go to trial, that the result is unpredictable. And actually, if you think about it, this principle, this fact, is a challenge to equality. The equality risk is being exposed by he who can afford the best lawyer, and also by the personality of the judge, which very, very, very often, actually it is a principle of most democracies, is chosen in a random fashion. The judge, not the lawyer. This is a grave threat to democracy and to respect of our institutions. I mean, just imagine yourself being exposed to what you believe is a biased decision, or maybe the judge didn't even take into account all your arguments, or you had a poor lawyer, or whatever. It was a bad day. You would probably find it very hard to believe in the institutions of democracy, and this is a major risk. Let me give you some examples of influencing of judges, examples that I found through some research, and they're not from yesterday or the day before yesterday. Some of them date back a couple of years, but unfortunately, the influencing of judges has not changed to the better. Again, with social media and so on, it is very, very difficult for a judge to perform his functions in the way that he's supposed to. Now, I would say that the first case of the miscarriage of justice, which actually will bring me back later to the application of artificial intelligence, is a leading case in the UK, which is the Sally Clark case. This is a case which actually goes back to the 1990s, and then it continues up to the year 2000. And I would highly recommend that you read the case because it's frightening. So Sally Clark had 2 children, and they both died in infancy. And as if that was not bad enough with those terrible tragedies, she was actually convicted of murdering her 2 children. She was convicted on the basis of statistics. So there was this expert statistician who said that the probability of someone losing his 2 children in childbirth for that given area in the UK at that given point in time, for that demographic situation, was something like 1 to 73 million. And this had such an important impact on the juries and the judge that they said, of course, she is guilty, 1 in 73 million. It is obvious that there is no way that it could be someone else or that it could be a pure accident. This is her, she killed her children. And she went to prison. And then finally, some true statisticians came up with the real numbers. Because of course the mistake that was made was that the statistician in question had actually taken the square of one ratio and applied it as a general ratio. The one ratio that he took was 1 up to 8,500, which was what he believed would be the probability of someone losing their child in childbirth accidentally at that point in time, at that place. So what he did was, and this was the mistake, he simply took the square of 8,500 and arrived at 1 to 73 million. Of course, that is a major mistake, a statistical error, which violates the basic rules of so-called Bayesian logic, which should have been identified much, much earlier in the process. She went to prison, and it was only because another statistician took up the case and actually showed the miscarriage of justice. You can very easily see how AI could have helped in that particular case. I shall give you another 3 examples of, in this case, not influencing of judges by poor facts, so to speak, but other ways of influences. One of the most famous is a study conducted on judges before and after lunch breaks. You may have heard about that study. What happened was that 1,000 cases were analyzed, and the question was how many cases actually ended up with a positive parole decision and how many cases ended up with a negative parole decision. And lo and behold, a hungry judge who hadn't eaten for some hours was much more harsh than the judge who just had a good supper or lunch or whatever he had. Breakfast was actually where it all started. Now, just think about that. You know that your fate is being decided by breakfast or lunch or dinner. That this is completely unacceptable, but this is the way we all are. And I remind you that judges are, for better or for worse, just like the rest of us. Few other examples. There was one which I would credit Dr. Brian Berry with. I can only recommend that you look him up, and he made some fantastic presentations on YouTube. This one deals with a football team in the state of Louisiana. It was the Tigers team, and they had lost some matches, and most of the players were actually black. It turned out that the judges in that state were much more harsh for quite some time after the football team had lost against black people than otherwise because they were influenced by the fact that the football team with black players had lost. Isn't that extraordinary? The last example I will give you is one which is in psychology is called a cognitive error, or to be more precise, anchoring. This dealt with fines against nightclubs for different misdemeanors like noise pollution and so on and so forth. Now, one nightclub was called 58, and the other, this was actually an experiment, not real life, it was an experiment. So there was the one nightclub was called 58, and the other was called 11,866. And what happened was that the fines against the nightclub with the highest number were much higher than the fines against the nightclub with the lower number. That is what is called anchoring, and of course completely unacceptable, has nothing to do with law, has nothing to do with equality, is completely subjective and follows the bias of our psychological makeup as individuals and therefore also as judges. Actually, the problem of influencing also judges was already identified by Aristotle back in the 5th century BC, and there was a wonderful thesis written by the German philosopher Schopenhauer in the 18th century under the title How to Win an Argument Even If You Lost. You should really, if you have time, read some of those because it shows you how easy it is to manipulate people. On this particular point, let me just tell you a joke. I think we all need that now. So there was this guy, he was in prison, and he got a very harsh prison sentence, and his lawyer says it was such a shame that you didn't have an alibi at the time. I could have gotten you off much lighter. And his client, he says, actually, I was in prison at the time for some minor offense. So the lawyer says, why didn't you say that? It was a fantastic alibi. And his client says, I was afraid of influencing the judges. Well, that is a pretty good story, isn't it? So what I've done now is to hopefully show you that judges are just human, and that we're all highly influenceable. And I've also attempted to show you that it is a major threat to democracy and institutional respect if this just continues the way it seems to be continuing and with the growth of social media influence. Now, AI has typically been criticized for being biased. And there may be some bias in AI, I will be the first to admit that. I'm not saying that the developers of AI are consciously biased. That may also happen, but I don't believe that is very often the case. But of course, they may make mistakes, and again, they are also only human. But I would venture to say that AI, which is based on logic, is less biased than we are. We, all of you are listening to this presentation, and judges are. Because AI is 100% objective. Now, would AI have applied the Bayesian logic mistake in the Sally Clark case? No, it would not. It would not. Because again, it is a major statistical error, and it would have prevented a miscarriage of justice. I would say that and I've actually recommended both to the French Ministry of Justice and to the European Commission that AI should be included in the judicial process, at least in the following manners. The first is profiling of judges. Now, this means that someone who is convicted typically of a crime, but it also may be a civil lawsuit, would have the possibility actually, he would also have that possibility during the trial to present evidence that the judge in question will typically be biased against him because of his social class, because of his creed, because of his color, whatever, based on simply similar judgments made by that judge over a period of time. his record, in other words. I think that is extremely important, again, also for equality, because it should not be random that your fate, because this is what happens, it's your life that is in the judge's hands, is simply decided by a person who is picked in random. You should have the ability to challenge that person's bias, not conflict of interest, but bias in general. AI could also be used to analyze precedent. In other words, a much quicker way of analyzing whether the same facts have led to significantly different judgments in other similar cases over a period of time. It will also assist the judge in the analysis of facts and evidence, not only in order to avoid the statistical errors that I mentioned before, but also analyze the facts in a way which will allow the judge much more easily, and also the defendant to demonstrate whether the burden of proof has been correctly applied. Now, all of this is just to say that typically, again, artificial intelligence is being challenged for being biased. I would say that the judicial system, unfortunately, is biased. Some countries are worse than others, but again, AI could be a solution that could be applied across the board. And again, I made these recommendations both to the European Commission and to the French Ministry of Justice. I'd be very happy to share whatever you may want to have in terms of references to the cases that I mentioned. And you're very welcome. You can get my email from the organizers, and I shall respond as quickly as possible. So enjoy yourself, and have a nice session.